Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So the election is now around the corner, and we've been talking about the politics of the campaign, but this week on the show, we're going to spend some time talking about policy. We'll try and wade through the many different promises being made by the major party leaders to tackle issues that are top of mind for voters right now, like pandemic recovery and climate change. But the first policy area we want to explore, which was one of the key themes of the debate last week, is affordability.
We're talking about people who are spending right now more than half their income on housing. That's not affordable.
That's why we've put forward a $10 a day childcare proposal that will save the average family in Toronto close to $10,000 more than Mr. O'Toole's approach.
We're going to get bills down for internet, for cellular phone. We're going to get grocery bills down. That is our plan and our commitment. And in December, we're going to give you
There's a long simmering affordability crisis in Canada spanning everything from housing to childcare to cell phone bills. Meanwhile, school and daycare closures have really highlighted the need for affordable childcare for a lot of families and have once again forced the conversation onto the national agenda. You've probably also been hearing about inflation and the general increase in the price of things like groceries and gas.
The housing market's got so out of whack with incomes that it's become the lens through which the affordability conversation in the election is really happening.
Mark Rendell is a reporter for the Globe's Report on Business, and he's here to help us compare the platforms of the three major parties on these issues. You're listening to The Decibel. Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we always hear the term affordability around election time. And when I think of affordability, I think of living costs in general. But when we are talking about affordability in the context of this election, what are we actually talking about?
I think the core of the conversation is about housing. Over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the real estate market go absolutely wild. And I think that's really underpinning how a lot of people are thinking about affordability. So, and now, another key aspect of it is childcare. That's a big difference between the political parties this time around. But, childcare is a major cost, major expense for young families. And there's some very different options on the table.
Yeah. What about inflation? Has that been a key theme in this election so far, do you think? And I guess first, can you tell us exactly what inflation is? And is that something that the parties are talking about?
Inflation and affordability are tied together, but they're not exactly the same thing. So the best way to think about inflation is how Statistics Canada measures it. So it takes a big basket of goods, gas prices, the price of lettuce at the grocery store, the price of hotel rooms, cars, all of that, pops it in a basket, and then it watches how much all of those prices together increase on a year-over-year basis. And one of the reasons why inflation is becoming a conversation topic during this election is that year-over-year increase in prices has hit a decade high in August, and it's been above the Bank of Canada, which is kind of the guardian of inflation in the country, quite a bit above their target range for the last several months. So that's kind of in the background. Now, the important thing to remember about inflation is it is a year-over-year comparison. So part of the reason it seems so high is because you had low gas prices early in the pandemic. But there's also a range of other things driving up inflation. So supply chains are really messed up all around the world. Shipping costs are going way up. So because you have this major supply chain disruption caused by the pandemic, that's forcing prices up across the board.
Right. So, but like you said, in the context of this election, the affordability conversation is really happening around childcare and housing. And let's talk about housing first. So what are the policies that the major parties are proposing to make housing more affordable for Canadians?
Yeah, so there's kind of two sides to how the parties are thinking about it. There's the demand side and there's the supply side. Now, the demand side of the equation, there's a number of proposals to try to cool the run-up in prices. And so, you have the Liberal Party suggesting banning blind bidding. So that's, the idea that if I go to buy a house, I don't know what my competitors are bidding as well. There's other things across the board around tackling, investment by foreign investors in the Canadian housing market. So both the Liberals and the Conservatives are suggesting a 2-year ban. The NDP is proposing a 20% buyer's tax on foreign investors. So then there's also the flip side of the demand policy proposals are various policies intended to make it easier for people to save money and making it more affordable for first-time buyers. Now, I should say off the bat, the demand side things especially are quite controversial, and there's a lot of concerns that simply putting more money into people's hands, is going to fuel the run-up in prices and not do much to address the affordability issue.
Right. We always hear economists say that in order to make housing more affordable in Canada, we need to build more houses. And so what are the policies that are on the table for the supply side of things?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Economists are generally agreed that supply is the major issue, that there's not enough houses being built in Canada, especially in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where population is growing pretty quickly. So the Conservatives, for instance, the kind of key part of their plan here is they're planning to tie transportation funding for municipalities to densification around those transportation projects. The Liberals are suggesting essentially a new $4 billion, what they call the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is a pot of money that's essentially designed to reward municipalities that move forward with faster permitting, pro-construction, zoning laws, that kind of stuff. So when you look at the housing supply promises from each of the parties, the Liberals are promising to encourage the construction of 1.4 million homes over the next 4 years. The Conservatives are promising 1 million homes over the next 3 years. And the NDP are targeting 500,000 units of affordable housing over the next 10 years. So a big thing to keep in mind on all of these numbers is they look big and they look flashy, but they include houses that are already being built. So when you look at the rate of housing construction, the rate of housing starts over the last 6 months or so, it's around an annualized pace of 280,000 or so. So you multiply that by 3, you get to just shy of 900,000 homes, which isn't that short of what the Conservatives are promising. And, when you look at it in terms of the Liberals' 4-year plan, it's not that much short there. So the parties are suggesting things that will potentially increase the pace of building, but we're not talking about, them promising to build 1.4 million new homes out of the blue or, 500,000 affordable housing units in the NDP's case completely out of the blue. It's building on that construction that's already taking place.
And just going back to something that you said a little bit earlier about how the policies that they're introducing on the affordability side of things could actually drive up home prices even more. And can you explain that a little bit more? And are any of these policies actually going to help cool the housing market and bring prices down?
I think one of the interesting things when you talk about the supply side and the demand side is there's a bit of a timing issue, right? So the parties want to expand the housing supply, and at the same time, they want to make it easier to buy houses by putting more money in, first-time buyers' pockets. But if you're stimulating demand with, the various programs like the tax-free savings account and first-time home buyer benefit, and the new supply of housing, the increased supply of housing hasn't come online, then essentially you're stimulating demand before that supply is caught up. And it's a basic maxim of economics. You increase demand faster than supply, you're going to get a run-up in prices.
And I'm curious about the politics of creating these policies. Is this actually a top election issue? And I ask because we know that so many Canadians are homeowners and they don't want to see the prices of their homes go down.
I think largely the affordability question, especially this election, is being tackled so much through the prism of the housing market. And you have a lot of young people who are looking at trying to get into the market and are seeing it, the housing market, and are seeing it essentially as, impossible. I think you have a lot of older people who are looking at their kids and thinking, are they going to be able to get into the housing market? And you got to remember that, the housing market is one of the key drivers of wealth creation. And so if you have a generation of Canadians who have a real tough time getting onto that essentially housing escalator, that creates a problem of intergenerational wealth. And just to give you, a sense of how much of a task it is, to get onto the housing, into the housing market if you're a young home buyer. I mean, I saw some recent numbers from National Bank, which suggests, they say if you want to buy a home, a non-condo home in Toronto, they estimate you need to be earning about $200,000 household income. Now, the median household income in Toronto is about $86,000. So there's this huge gap between the income and how much it actually you need to be earning to essentially afford one of these houses. And just the amount of time to save up on the down payment. National Bank estimates that if you're earning that median income, household income, and you're saving 10% of your earnings, it's going to take you, I think it was 318 months, which is 26 years to save up for that down payment. So the housing market's got so out of whack with incomes that it's become the lens through which the affordability conversation in the election is really happening.
So jumping off the point that you just made, that the gap between the median income and how much it costs to own a home is so big that there's a lot of people who aren't even in a position to think about buying a home, and they're renting and maybe have accepted that they're going to be renting forever. So is there anything being proposed to help renters by the major parties?
The NDP is the most aggressive policy around affordable house construction. So they are saying, over the next 10 years, they want to build 500,000 new affordable housing units across the country. The Conservatives are suggesting offering a tax break to developers on capital gains taxes if they're reinvesting profits in rental properties. So the idea being trying to increase that rental supply as well. The Liberals have suggested a new rent-to-own program, the idea being that over time, renters can potentially put equity into what will become their home through renting. So that's one aspect of Liberal thinking. They're also thinking about tackling the supply side of the rental market as well. On the rental side of things, it's primarily from the supply side that the parties are trying to tackle this.
And the one other question I wanted to ask you is, one of the driving forces behind the recent surge in housing prices has been the low interest rates that the Bank of Canada introduced to help stimulate the economy, which in turn encourage people to go out and buy homes. Can the government do anything about that? Can they increase interest rates?
So governments typically don't comment on monetary policy. As a general rule, the Bank of Canada is independent when it sets interest rates. So the idea is you want to take interest rate decisions out of political hands, because politicians have, an incentive to potentially run the economy hot, even if it's going to lead to inflation for electoral reasons. 30 years ago, they made the Bank of Canada essentially solely responsible for targeting inflation and made them the guardians of interest rate policy.
Yeah, that makes sense. So aside from housing, I know we're talking about mostly about housing when we talk about affordability, but what else has gotten more expensive, and are people feeling it?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the various party platforms, the NDP talks about putting a cap on cell phone bills. The Conservatives want to essentially encourage foreign telecommunication companies to compete in Canada, with the idea that, introducing more competition among telecoms companies is going to drive down internet bills. So I think the key issue is alongside housing, and perhaps the key differences between the parties has to do with childcare, which is obviously a major expense, especially for young families.
So childcare has been top of people's minds because of school and daycare shutdowns, and it's become one of the central issues of this campaign. And so why don't we start with the Liberals' plan on childcare? How are they planning to make childcare more affordable for Canadians?
So in the April budget, the Liberals introduced this idea of $10 a day childcare. So they say within 5 years, we're going to have $10 a day childcare across the country. They say, by next year, we're going to reduce the cost of childcare by 50%, and we're going to build out of a whole lot more subsidized childcare spaces across the country. So that's still what they're going forward with in the election. They've signed agreements with 7 provinces and 1 territory. So I think the important thing on that question is the Liberals are really pitching their childcare plan as not just an affordability issue, but also as an economic growth issue. The idea is by providing more affordable subsidized daycare spaces, you're allowing more young mothers to return to the workforce. So the idea being, you're not just making things affordable for individual families, but you're also potentially increasing your workforce, which is increasing your, the amount of taxable income being developed in the economy or being generated in the economy. The NDP also support, and the Greens, I should say, also support $10 a day childcare. And that's one of the major points of difference between the Liberals NDP on one hand and the Conservatives on the other, because the Conservatives they're suggesting scrapping that plan and replacing it with a tax credit, which parents who are paying for childcare could claim a tax credit to cover part of those expenses. But I should say the major differences in the programs, major differences in the size of the programs as well. Liberals are saying they're going to spend roughly $30 billion over the next 5 years on childcare. Conservative plan estimates roughly $2.6 billion.
So I wonder if you can put that in terms of savings for the average person. What's the difference between the Liberals and the NDP's universal childcare promise and the refundable tax credit that the Conservatives are proposing?
Yeah, so the Conservative plan is essentially to reimburse a certain amount of expenses for families that they spend on childcare. And it is linked to income. So essentially they're saying if you're a family and you have a net income less than around $36,000, you can claim the max benefit, which is about $6,000. The Liberal plan, again, is $10 a day childcare. How much of a saving that's going to be, obviously depends on what city you're living in and the cost of childcare. I saw the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives estimated that under the Liberal plan, a Toronto family with an infant in a subsidized spot could save, more than $11,000 next year. But I should say as well, the Liberal plan applies to subsidized spots where the Conservative plan applies to essentially anybody who's paying for daycare. So it's going to take a number of years to build out subsidized daycare spots. So in the interim, under the Conservative plan, essentially anybody's going to be able to claim this tax credit.
So there are plans to make housing cheaper, to make childcare cheaper, to make life more affordable for people, but you could also go at it from the other end, right, and increase people's wages. And so what do the parties have planned in terms of creating more higher paying jobs?
Yeah, so the jobs component is key. We have seen a major bounce back in employment, especially over the summer as these industries have opened up. So last month's unemployment rate dropped from 7.5 down to 7.1%, but we're still 150, 160,000 jobs short of where we were pre-pandemic. So the short-term focus on jobs is about extending those pandemic-era supports, making sure people are hired back. Over the longer term, the parties are thinking about job creation in a couple of different ways. A big focus for the NDP and for the Liberals is, the transition to a lower carbon economy. So, both parties are speaking a lot about creating jobs in the retrofit economy. So, good trade jobs, having people retrofitting houses. They're also talking a lot about manufacturing as well and supporting manufacturing jobs. And this is actually an interesting thing where, you have some cross-party consensus. All the parties are leaning quite heavily into industrial policy, the idea of essentially pumping money into key industries. So, across the board, you have people talking about support for electric vehicle manufacturing in Canada, support for the hydrogen industry out in Alberta, and the NDP as well. The NDP, probably not surprisingly, talk a lot about a national industrial strategy and the idea of targeted government spending to industry. But it is striking to see it being quite a popular plan across the board.
Yeah, and I wonder if you can make the link between job creation and how that makes life more affordable for the average person.
Yeah, I think if there's good jobs being created, people are earning higher incomes. And that gap that we talked about earlier, that gap between income and affordability, whether that's income and your monthly rent or income and the daunting prospect of trying to get into the housing market, or if you are a house owner, paying those massive mortgage costs. So if you are creating jobs in high paid and innovative industries, if you're making sure that manufacturing jobs don't disappear, making sure that good jobs at innovative companies are there, making sure that entrepreneurs have the ability to attract capital to build out businesses, I think all ultimately goes towards what we all, would hope to see, which is that income coming up a little bit relative to that big gap between that and affordability. And housing is the big thing there, but if you're making more money as well, maybe the cell phone bills and the childcare costs don't seem quite so steep.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much for helping me connect the dots and for all of this information. I really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. Michal Stein edited this episode. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Mark Rendell. You can find him on Twitter at Mark_Rendell. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.